Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific car review for Forza Motorsport 7, and this particular car is one which is carried over. It's not that new a vehicle to the Forza franchise, the Porsche 918 Spyder, a hybrid hypercar, if you will, supercar at the very least, if not hypercar, and of course this is the primary rival to some of the other most popular modern exotics, including the LaFerrari, the McLaren P1, and those are the two main ones, but also potentially now the Mercedes Project One could also be a good rival for those cars. It certainly has the potential to be, if not better. Now this car is very popular, and for good reason. Porsches are popular anyway, so when you take a Porsche and really present it as the pinnacle of Porsche, it's going to be popular. That's what the Carrera GT did, and that's what this one does as well. Visually, there are some very notable similarities between this and the Carrera GT. The buttressed engine bay is very similar. Back end of the car, for instance, is also very similar. Even the wing has similarities to the Carrera GT. But, and I didn't realise this until the other day, the front end of this car, and I don't know if you guys will agree with this or not, but to me, I noticed the other day that this looks so much like a Ferrari 360 Modena from the front end. It's actually unreal. The headlights are very similar, the bumper is very similar, the air intakes are almost identical. They are very, very similar looking cars. But, of course, visuals aside, what does the 918 have to offer? Because the price is quite high. It's 1.15 million credits, but at the same time, you can win this car. So what do you get when you do potentially win the vehicle? Well, the class that it's featured in is quite high, R858. That's very high, in fact, for a road car, but it's justified, because like the McLaren, the Ferrari, etc., the specs on this model are very impressive. 887 horsepower thanks to the hybrid system, 829 pound-feet of torque, again thanks to being a hybrid, and although it is heavy, it's certainly not ridiculously heavy. It's lighter, for instance, than a Veyron or an SLR McLaren or even the NSX, which we reviewed recently. It weighs 1,675 kilos, and even with that weight, which you could consider to be perhaps not as good as you might hope, with 887 horsepower and 829 pound-feet on board, it's not exactly going to be slow. The acceleration is fantastic, especially given that unlike the McLaren and the Ferrari, it's full-time all-wheel drive, so it's got great performance off the line. Top-end performance as well is fantastic, and although it's not necessarily the kind of machine which you would always use for top-end performance, there are some other supercars which you might think of in that way instead, it can definitely deliver, especially when tuned in that regard. But with vehicles like this, the P1, the LaFerrari, the 918, they're almost in a subcategory, in a subclass of their own within the grand scheme of supercars or hypercars or megacars even, or exotics, however you want to categorize them, because most supercars tend to specialize in one or two particular things. They tend to be straight line machines or track day specials. So straight line machines would be stuff like the Veyron, the Hennessy, most Koenigsegg's. They have some handling ability, but that's not really the foremost priority. Then of course you have some others which do have more cornering ability as their, not necessarily main goal, but a much higher priority. Something like a Noble M600 or an Ultima GTR. They're great in a straight line, but they have a very good, very strong all-round mix for the track in particular. And then of course you have the outliers, the cars which I like the most, the ones which don't really care about either. They have a good amount of handling, a good amount of straight line speed, but they're not necessarily vying to be the best in either way. That would include stuff like your Spykers, your Paganis, your Zenvos, the cars which are fast, but they're never going to try to be top 5, for instance. This car though, along with the P1 and the LaFerrari, is a kind of supercar which goes to the next level in every way. It's not really specialised in any particular regard. It's extremely strong in a straight line and around corners, and that is reflected by how high the class is. 858 PI is, as I mentioned earlier, extremely high for a road car. Now of course it's an exotic, so you expect it to be high, but that's really high. That's like beyond some GT class race cars high. And when you've got that kind of level that you're working with, you expect a lot from the car, especially when it's a Porsche as well. So the question is, does the 918 deliver on that as well as the McLaren or Ferrari do? Because they're very popular and for good reason. They're both brilliant. They're different, but both brilliant at the same time. The McLaren has a very passionate, but also very clinical, very almost robotic approach. It just gets the job done, whereas the LaFerrari's got all that passion, the F1 tech, much more predominantly shown in a similar way to the Enzo, but more of that Italian passion behind it. The Porsche, like the McLaren, being a German car, and also just a Porsche in general, could be far more clinical. Less passion, more performance, more efficiency, Nissan GTR style. Now the 918 I would say is not as passionate as the Carrera GT was. That's still my favourite Porsche, and that car is much more in the Zonda F kind of camp, where it doesn't really care about being the fastest, it's just a pure driving machine to be as brilliant as possible just to drive. The 918 has not necessarily world records directly in its sight, but it's certainly more capable at things like that. So if you get the chance to win the 918, which you do very early on in the game in fact, you should take that opportunity, because of course it's worth winning. Now you could sell it in the auction house, why you'd want to I don't know, but I would recommend keeping a car like this, not just for career mode, but for online stuff as well, because as I said earlier, these cars go beyond just straight line speed or just handling, and the fact that they have such a good amount of both, they're not necessarily the best at either, but they offer such a high amount of both, that they are formidable opponents. And when you tune them, as I mentioned earlier, they are extremely responsive to that. So, overall, it's definitely a car that's worth checking out. Pretty much goes without saying that it is. And of course, you can check out more of my car reviews for Forza 7 by clicking through to the full list at the end of this video. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.